Good afternoon, everybody. Today I have with me Dave Brown, CISO at Andesite, on today's episode of the Strategic CISO series, and I'm super excited to talk to Dave about a topic that a lot of you have shared with us is something that you've been thinking about, which is how do we upgrade GRC into a profit center? My name is Ravish. I'm the founder and CEO of TrustCloud, a security assurance platform that is focused on helping CISOs in mid-market and enterprise businesses really reimagine GRC, and we call ourselves the AI platform for GRC transformation. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to be on today's webinar.
Definitely a pleasure to see you again, Shravish. And thanks to everybody who's joined.
Dave, to kick things off, I think the everybody on today's webinar would love to know your story. You've got this really interesting story on how you've become a CISO, all the various things you've done in your career. So if you could share your background just to show that CISOs can come from any background, multiple perspectives, and what type of thinking makes a great CISO. Would love to hear your story, Dave.
Ooh, the last question's a good one. I think that's an evolving one, actually. Yeah, so I was in the Coast Guard for 21 years, and my last job was managing the computer incident response team, and that's where I sort of got my passion about like building cyber programs and helping organizations solve these complex cyber issues. Since then, I've been a consultant. I spent time in Homeland Security. I actually saw one of the visitors today, who's a former colleague. Great to see you. And after Homeland, I went to be a CISO again. It was the second time. I was there for 8 years. I got to build the program pretty much from ground zero, which was exciting. And then we were acquired for 1.2 billion. And then I had the opportunity to come to Andesite initially as their head of security and compliance and build the program, security compliance IT program from the ground up to what we're calling Compliance High. And I'll go through what that means throughout our session. I've gotten to teach. I was an adjunct for 6 years. I love that. It was a lot of fun. And I got to see those students actually come into some pretty interesting career paths. But for me, what's unique, what makes a unique CISO, I think generally it's somebody who has this passion to build programs that literally align to the business. And it's something I'm very passionate about. I listen to what the business is saying so that if I have to pivot what I'm doing programmatically, I do that. And why I like startup companies is because I like to build from nothing. And it's just something about being able to then step back 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 8 year, and see what you've built with a business is pretty incredible.
Yeah. And Dave, I think, when you say the word startup, people would have different definitions of startup. Andesite, obviously scaling really quickly. You're winning lots and lots of customers. So Andesite is in a much more complex environment than an average small startup. So how do you think about going into that kind of hyperscale environment? And like I think you said, the CISO should think about the business objectives. You've come into this hyperscaling environment. What are the first 2 or 3 things that you're trying to figure out as a CISO?
So my first 90 days, I always do one thing and one thing only, and that's learn what the business objectives are and then build a cyber objective to align to those business objectives so that the business sees me as part of the business and not just a cost center, right? The cost center thing is definitely not going to work to your benefit, right? And I was hired at Andesite to literally look at what are we going to be when we start to sell product, right? We had this thing called Compliance High, building to FedRAMP High, which we've done. We've gone through our FedRAMP High security assessment. We've done exceptionally well, and we're working on sponsorship. We want to go after financial services. There's very strict compliances to support that. Healthcare, very strict compliances to do that, and then internationally. So we built this program, Compliance High, that literally centers on strong security, strong compliance, and trustworthy AI. We are an AI SaaS company, an AI SaaS security company, more importantly. And it became very important to make sure that the customers felt like we too were part of their security program. We understood the risk of vendor and third-party risk management, and we want to be seen as a trusted vendor.
And when you, Dave, on that note, when you and I talked about various topics over the last couple of months, one
Yeah.
of the things you told me was really resonated, which at the end of the day, you're passionate that security should not be seen as a cost center. So I asked you the question, so what does that mean? Like, what is a profit center? And you basically said, look, it's really simple.
Mhm.
I need to increase revenue, I need to reduce cost, and I need to reduce risk. And it's essentially an arithmetic, it's a sum of those three things. Is the top line going up? Am I costs going down or at least being stable, even though I'm being asked to do more with less? And am I reducing the overall financial liability and risk of the business? And I really love how you frame that. Could you could you give us a little bit more insight on taking that framework
Right.
and doing the thing that you just said earlier, which is mapping to the objectives of the business and objectives of the board?
Yeah, I was starting to kind of wanted to build sort of the big vision that we had, right? Which is a very lofty big business. The thing that I understood is that it was not going to be easy to do it by utilizing a bunch of spreadsheets, right? One of the things I experienced in my last CISO job was, now we want to go internationally. We want to do ISO 27001. I have to go through the standards. There's a lot of toil to do it. And so identifying technology that I could bring standards in rapidly, I could tie it to my technology. I could have self-assessments evaluating where we were so I could start to close those gaps down and then have the automated testing that similarly did the same thing, right? So now I have evidence that I can provide to prospective customers, to design partners. And for those who don't know what a design partner is for a startup, they're the people looking at your technology, giving you feedback as you grow to go to general availabilities, which is when you sell.
Yeah.
And so I needed an AI tool to help me do that. And risk is not just about doing the compliance and closing the compliance. It's also about a risk register. And the security program is part of the business. So being part of the risk register and helping the business understand what risk has been identified and how to reduce it, transfer it, whatever the case may be. And then also the third party risk, which is an area we really focus a lot of effort on, not only from the security and compliance perspective, but privacy information, and more importantly, AI. So our head of AI actually evaluates any technology we bring in. And more importantly, I wanted everything to tie into a single sign-on with multi-factor authentication because that reduces risk significantly. And also, I'm the CIO as well as being the CISO. So I wanted the end user experience to feel almost white glove so that they weren't frustrated, constantly having to reset passwords. But then it was secure, acknowledging that users sometimes pick bad passwords. So
Yeah.
a bit of a broad response to your question, but that
No, this
was
is
sort of
great.
how I looked at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to unpack a couple of things that you said, and starting with uh, you talked about like building culture and operations. Because once you figured out the priorities, you said, look, I need to educate the entire organization
Yes.
on those objectives and get every employee bought in on why we're doing the things that we're doing. And the way you explained it to me was it wasn't like a check the box, we just need to go achieve compliance or we just need to like just go and assess risk, right? We're trying to become stronger as a business, and you use the word resilience. And I love how you're always thinking about revenue all the time. So what would be super helpful? One of the questions that we got asked before the webinar started was, how do you educate the entire employee base about your priorities and how those priorities map to the priorities of the business?
Yeah, I love that question a lot. So I remember a conversation with my boss maybe a couple months after I started where I thought maybe some of the things we were doing would be potentially difficult for people to understand. He's like, "Hey, you're an educator, go educate us." And so I said, "Okay, challenge accepted." So I do this thing called demystifying security and compliance.
Mm,
And what that means is when I look at security policy, that's where it starts. What's accepted, what's not acceptable use, what do we expect to do, who do we report to if we believe that there's some sort of suspicious behavior or event, and you start there. And then you explain this creates procedures and standards, and why are we doing that? We're doing that because we're building to this FedRAMP high instance, for example. And then how it gets evaluated, how we train up on all that stuff. And I'll get to the training in a second, and sort of the approach I believe that training needs to be, which is not the what, but more the why. Then I get to the compliance component of it, which is we're building to these high standards so we can sell. We're building to these so that we can sell to the federal government, we can sell internationally, we can sell to these heavily regulated industries, and it's going to be a tremendous amount of work, but here's the longer term benefit. Then people know why they're doing it, which is tremendously useful. I think that when people don't know why they're doing something, then their minds spin in different directions. So I think transparency is very important. We have channels where, our employees can ask us questions all the time. I make myself available all the time because you've got to be ready to answer questions, especially if, let's say, for example, an engineer is trying to figure out how to implement something and it's super complex and difficult. You need to be there to listen to it and help walk them through that so that they can come to some sort of reasonable implementation of what you're asking them to do. But when I do my annual refresher training or new hire training, I say why we're here. We are here to talk about all the changes and how this supports the compliance high initiative we have, the changes that have happened in the last 3 months, and the things we're going to be doing in the next 9. And then people start to understand it. I also really do fundamentally think it's important that it's engaging. So showing pictures that are a bit comedic in there, and calling on people in the audience and making it where people can relate to it is really, really important.
I love that. It's like almost, I've got little kids at home, Dave, and they keep asking me why anytime I tell them to do it. And I think you almost have to remind yourself that the same culture has to be in the workplace too. You have to educate the why instead of just telling people, go do a bunch of stuff.
Yes.
So I have to remember to be almost like a dad in the workplace all the time. And what about any thoughts on how do you extend this ecosystem of support? You talked about how you want to educate your employees, your colleagues, you want to explain the why, but then, you still need to bring in partners. You need to bring in consultants. You need to bring in vendors, auditors. How do you think about the broader ecosystem of support that you bring in to achieve those business objectives?
Yeah, I will get to the internal, external partnerships in a second because that's very important. But like, for instance, we took the CISA Secure by Design pledge. Something I was asked, could we do it? And I thought to myself, well, everybody should do this, right? This kind of makes sense. And then you see, CISOs of JP Morgan Chase penning letters to suppliers saying, hey, this is what we need from you, because we fundamentally need to ensure that you're thinking security up front, right? So the other thing is, for CISOs, and it's difficult sometimes. There was an article that was just released in CPO magazine specifically on sort of how I view the stresses of the SOC analyst and things that CISOs can do to help with that. And part of it's how we start to open the two-way communication between board and us as CISOs, right? To sometimes maybe get wrapped a little too much around the technical. So when I talk about going back to your other part, the internal, external partnerships, if you cannot work across the business to be able to explain the rationale as to why we're doing certain things, so building to compliance high so that we can sell, for instance, you're not going to get the support. You're not going to be successful. So, I meet with the senior leadership team. Sometimes it's once a week, at minimum once a month, across the business all the time. And again, like I said, I make myself available in our messaging system if people have questions, because I want to be able to answer their questions because they're the ones delivering. The other partnership I think is the most important is I have an amazing team. I have assembled an amazing team. I have an IT manager who does total white glove service for all the employees and is building to the compliance high all the time. I joined a meeting with him one day and he started talking about compliance high and this is what we're doing. And this is why I never joined another vendor call again. I didn't have to. I have a cybersecurity manager who's built our SOC, our pen testing, our bug bounty program, application security. So there's code review, all that. The point I'm trying to make is that, and I don't want to forget our audit manager is amazing and our TPM is amazing. The reason that's important is because they also have to be part of that building trust relationships.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a perfect example. A lot of the times, if you can show like the leadership across the organization, I built a strategy of the business. This is why. Here's how I believe it's going to influence you. And if you see any issues, I'd like to know now so that we can work on that together, right? That collaborative spirit goes a long way. But don't forget, your leaders are also working across the industry or across the business to do the exact same thing, right? They may be the ones that are interacting with the engineers on a regular basis to walk them through why we're doing, the SAST and how that helps them in the code review process, things of that nature, right? So they also become advocates and also an extension if you have this mindset, which is extremely important. Now let's pivot to external partnerships, because this is where the fun for me began, right? I knew with this very large, grandiose idea that we were trying to deliver on called Compliance High. And I'll give if you want to go to compliancehigh.com, it goes to our trust center, and it'll show the 15 different standards and frameworks that we are continuously, and I mean continuously, auditing on. And so we have to maintain 95% of that audit standard being correct or higher, and 95% evidence collected. And so we call it continuous monitoring and auditing. And the point of, please don't ask for, by the way, don't ask for access, because if you're not a prospective customer, I can't give it to you. You at least see what we're doing. But so it's been like working, and this is not an infomercial, but working with TrustCloud so that we could build out a strong presence. Thank you very much. A strong presence. I look at trust centers when I look at our third-party risk management. I do. Now, we have one third-party validated and the rest is self-assessment, but we're currently in the process of our third-party assessment for 7 compliance standards, which will be done this week, which is a tremendous amount of work, right? 537 controls, and I think we've given 15x in the number of evidence collected. So if it's a self-assessment, we say so. The point is a prospective customer, existing customer can go in and they can look and see that we're continuously auditing over 500 controls, which is tremendously useful if you're trying to validate, particularly a small company like us that's 16 months, 17 months out of incubation. So that's very valuable. We also are building a FedRAMP boundary, so finding a partner externally that could help us do that with that proven history of helping with authorities to operate was one of the other things. A very strong pen tester, infrastructure tester, and AI assessor. And we do that twice a year, not once. Industry standard is once, we do it twice, because we want to learn from people who are doing this every day around the world. So that's another thing that we do. And I'm sure I'm missing some other ones, but you cannot deliver big programs without third-party vendors. And what it really becomes is they become sort of an extension of your expertise. And what I love about the ones that I've chosen, TrustCloud and the others, also your auditor firm, super important. You get to learn from them and the expertise on things that they do every single day. So, the aspiration is you get better.
Dave, the level of transparency that you've created in how you're talking about your security program is just phenomenal. I just want to commend you on that. TrustCloud works with almost 2,000 companies. And the level of transparency, the comprehensiveness, 502 controls for those of you who are not familiar with is extremely comprehensive in how Dave is assessing it. And obviously what he hasn't talked about yet, which we will talk about shortly, is these also map to risks, and that helps you automate risk assessments to become stronger. But the fact that you're showcasing your controls, the fact that a customer can come in here and click on a control and understand it, validate that you're testing it regularly, see how it maps to different standards through this really nice crosswalk that shows all of the 15 standards that you're meeting and how this control maps to one or more of those standards. It's really amazing. The level of comprehensiveness and transparency and culture that you're building both internally and externally with the customers is fantastic.
I appreciate that. I do want to give props to TrustCloud. I had this idea of self-accountability when it came to the CISO Secure by Design pledge, and I asked if you would build a custom module, which you did. Same applies for FedRAMP High. because I wanted to evaluate our commercial side at the FedRAMP high standard so that when we implemented in the FedRAMP boundary, it would be seamless and it would create mind muscle. And without, a partner like TrustCloud to be able to do that again, I'm not trying to make this an infomercial, but I'm just trying to emphasize a point. We would not have been able to do that. It would not be as seamless as it is today. So
Yeah.
thank you and your team for that.
Thank you. Dave, so let's switch to the next topic. So just to sort of summarize, what are like two or three specific things that a GRC leader or a CISO leader should try to put in practice to achieve the first objective, which is you want to understand your board and business priorities and create your security program and your security strategy against it? What are two or three specific things that they can take away from today and try to action in their day job?
So when I talked about my first 90 days and defining what my objectives were going to be, at least for the first 30 days, 90 days, 120 days, that then got pushed to the board on a quarterly basis for them to see what our goals and objectives were from a security compliance, AI, trustworthiness perspective, and then show that we were delivering on that, right?
Yeah.
So that's super important. Once you deliver on that, the next phase becomes, well, you need to start selling. And so having the ability to be able to say, this is how I look at the sales pipeline, and I can map it to the investment I've made from a compliance perspective becomes extremely important. And I'll just give some example numbers. They're not real numbers. Let's say that I spent $150,000 on my compliance priorities, right? If our sales pipeline is $3 million and we're able to close on 1.5 million, I've already seen a return on that investment.
Yep.
So I think that's really important to be able to do that. And in our Trust Center, I have the ability to be able to, when a prospective customer comes in, I validate them against the CRM and I tie that to the prospective revenue. So that's a starting point. The other thing I do is I work with the chief revenue officer now to then bring in all the phases of our sales pipeline. And then I map the investment for the commercial side and the investment on the federal side, which is different, by the way, if you haven't experienced that.
Yep.
And then I show, we want to show the board what each one of those phases are with respect to what we've invested per each one of the phases of the pipeline. So that's the other thing. It's just delivering on what you say you're going to do. I fundamentally always believe in under promise and over deliver. And I think
one of the questions, Dave, that just came in from Steve, and Steve clearly is in the security business, or he's a CISO himself, because his full name in the chat is Steve. Do not add me to the mailing list. I love that.
Hi, Steve.
So Steve's question, which I think you answered partly already, but maybe you could give a little bit more context, is how do you track the metrics on how your Trust Center facilitates the business and the revenue? And do you have customers that forego the assessment because of the Trust Center? So in other words, do you avoid the dreaded security questionnaire? As some of you could see, my favorite slogan, friends don't send friends security questionnaires. Do you avoid some of the security questionnaires with your Trust Center?
What I would say to date is we've reduced impact, right? Like your third-party risk is in the forefront, I believe, of probably every CISO and CIO's mind.
Yeah.
Right? That ecosystem becomes an extension of their ecosystem, and so there's a lot of concerns around that. But the Trust Center, Steve, just so you know, has the ability to bring in the customer questionnaire. And because I've already started to answer questionnaires, I can answer a questionnaire within hours versus days. So my ability to be able to respond back to a customer is much quicker. If I can reduce that kind of timeline, it's unbelievable. Oh, and by the way, I've reduced a tremendous amount of toil, particularly when cyber people are already so overly worked. So one of the other things I love is the ability to be able to track what documents each customer is downloading. So if I spend, this is the way I was thinking about it earlier. If I buy this vendor questionnaire that I've seen once or twice, and I say, I'm going to spend $5,000 for it, I'm going to populate it, and no one ever downloads it, why am I going to make that investment next year? Why am I going to spend that time answering that questionnaire? That's very valuable insights to me, not only from what are the customers looking at, but also what are they not looking at? so that I don't spend time and effort on it.
That's great. And I see we have a question potentially from Ryan. Ryan, if you've got the question, you could just type it into the Q&A chat, and we'll definitely get to it. Uh, Dave, doubling down on some of the pictures that we see on the screen,
Yes.
this is just an example of the kinds of graphs and charts that we've seen CISOs sent to their boards. And again, like you said correctly earlier, ultimately this kind of reporting should align to the business objectives, right? So if the business objective is you want to show how you support pipeline or close revenue, then it may be a chart like the one in the bottom of the slide, where it's actually the deals that are closed and how much revenue was closed that quarter and how many opportunities there were, and what is the speed of supporting those opportunities. Uh, I've seen some other companies where the challenge and objective they're looking to solve for is the SLA on completing a security review with a customer. And so the chart on the top right becomes a more interesting one where on a weekly basis you're tracking how long it took to complete a questionnaire.
Yes.
And eventually you provide an SLA to your sales team and you're able to show if you're meeting that SLA or not. Are there any specific KPIs that you've thought about measuring on how to show your alignment with revenue?
Yeah, primarily it's as I described earlier, where I want to look at each stage of the sales pipeline, right? Whether
Yeah,
it's prospect, whether it's in contract negotiation, whether it's closed, and look at it in each one of those phases. And over time, this is just for me, I want to see it go from prospect to closed, right?
mm,
And so I want to show that over time, so that if I go up 3, 4 quarters and things are in the middle and they're not getting to the right, then we can start to look at, is it this sort of stuff? Like, is it taking too long to respond to the questionnaires?
got it.
Those are obviously very important discussions for like field engineers. That's probably more important for them and account executives than potentially the board. But there's still an opportunity to have that business discussion with the appropriate business leader. So I love these charts, by the way, because they help me have the conversation. For the board, it depends on the board and it depends on the level of granularity they want to go in. But for me right now, I'm just focused on that. I'm also focused on like security, the security return on investment. So
Yeah.
let's say phishing is costing small to medium sized businesses, X percentage, millions of dollars a year, and I'm investing in monthly phishing exercises and things like that. I want to show those types of statistics as well. So I think it goes beyond just the compliance. It also is the security as well. But definitely you want to show how you're aligning to sales if you're in a sales heavy organization.
Yep. And there's another persona that we have to align with often as a security leader, which is product management, because product management is looking at expanding into new markets. They're looking at expanding into new geographies, going after some verticals, et cetera. And that's where, in many ways, compliance, both regulatory compliance and commercial compliance, feeds in, because if you don't have certain compliance standards, you can't expand into those markets. How do you have that conversation around prioritizing which compliance standards to prepare for and get audited against?
So that is a very interesting question. I think about a lot of the times, if you're a larger organization, you have more time to be methodical about going into a particular locality. So maybe Europe, for instance. In my last company, that's what I experienced. We were US centric. Then we started selling into the European market. So it was the decision. I went to the senior leadership team and they went to the board. It's like, we need to go ISO 27001. We're going to be more successful in that. For the current program that I'm building out, it allows for a lot. I don't want to say boil the ocean, but it's almost like boil the ocean. I want to give you a for instance of the compliance standards that we're doing today. FedRAMP High, we're doing SOC 2 Type 2, PCI, High Trust, 3 ISO standards, and the CSA Star Level 2. And the reason we're doing that is because, again, as I recognize heavily regulated industries, government, financial services, and healthcare, and that should satisfy most of them and give us the ability to sell in the European market as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting question. What I like about the tool we use for GRC is I can bring in those compliance standards. I can close those gaps. I can set us up to be successful when we go into the third party. There will be findings, but there will be less findings if I'm able to do that. So it gives me the ability to have those 15 frameworks and standards
Yeah.
and continuously audit against, and then be successful when we go to our third party audit.
Yeah. I think it also helps you have a conversation with product management around the relative effort required to go after a new standard. And is there resourcing and budget in place to go do that, or can you do it with the existing team that you have, right? And it helps you create prioritization decisions easier.
I just believe in trying to boil the ocean. I want the product that we have in the hands of everybody. So that's because the SOC analyst, I'm just going to say one thing. SOC analysts have so much fatigue around their job, so much frustration around their job. The stress level is too high and the burnout rate is way too high to the point where 70% impacts their home life. I want a SOC analyst to have a tool that can help them derive value quickly. And so that's why I built the program I built.
Dave, before we go on to the next topic, we have one more question from the audience. And the question is, do you map frameworks to customers to understand the demand ratio? And if so, how do you do it?
I do not today. That is a really interesting question. So let's say we wanted to go into a particular market that had a very unique law and required unique compliance standards. I do look at the customer compliance requirements. So I'll give you an example. A bank may send me their security requirements that's approved by their board once annually. I'll evaluate it against the compliance standards that we have to ensure there's no gaps, or we're prepared to respond to them nuancy things. But what I do look for is the number of documents that people are downloading. Are they downloading our HIPAA, security, privacy, and sanctions policy? Are they downloading our PCI policy? Things like that. So if they're not, then maybe that's not the right compliance standard. But today, I'm kind of trying to boil the ocean.
Yeah.
So, yeah, sorry if I didn't directly answer your question.
No, that's great. I think the net of it is, I think what you're saying is you do want to find a way to go from framework to customers to revenue, which is
100%.
Another comment, which I think is definitely possible. There's also another question, Dave, which is, why do you look so formal today?
Why do I look so formal? Okay, well, so full transparency, I am a finalist in a cybersecurity award, and
Nice.
the award ceremony is tonight. And so I did not wear my tie and suit, but that's why I'm so formal.
Tell us more about the award, Dave.
Oh, it's a Cybersecurity Heroes Award, I believe. It's through an organization called Cybersecurity Association. They're out of Maryland. They're an amazing organization. And, it's really about a lot of those type of cyber related organizations trying to help each other. And so, I hadn't heard of them before being nominated, but they're wonderful. I got to go to one of their events, and I'm excited to be going tonight.
Congratulations, Dave.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right, let's get into some of this fun stuff, which also aligns with what you're doing at Andesite too, with your approach on AI SOC. CISOs are inundated with more risks, more scope, growth in their infrastructure stack, growth in their applications, growth in third parties. So there's just more and more risks that just show up every day. And then in parallel, there's more and more compliance frameworks, there's more customer questionnaires. It's not a steady state job. If anything, it just keeps increasing week in and week out. And so ultimately, I think it's important to really think about automation as ways to do more with less, or at least do things that you don't want your team to be doing manually, so that your team can focus more on strategic work, not manual work.
Yes.
And so, with what I've learned about your strategy is you've really tried to connect into the different tools in your environment. You've tried to aggregate data from those tools. You've tried to map it to your controls, and then you've then mapped those controls to different parts of your security program, whether it's your compliance program, your customer trust program, and how you're responding to customers, how you're doing risk assessments, etc. Right?
Mm-hmm.
how do you think of how to start with automation? I think one of the questions we had from the audience was, you can automate many, many things. Is there a framework in the spirit of reducing costs or at least controlling costs? And how do you think about where to start first? Because there's so much opportunity. Where do we start?
Yeah. One of the requirements that we have as part of our third-party risk management as we provision applications. Now, again, we came out of stealth April 29th of last year, and that's just to give context. We have over 70 enterprise applications on our single sign-on.
Hmm.
And a secondary requirement is, if it's possible, I want it to tie into TrustCloud. And the reason is I want to be able to automate our audits as much as possible, so that as we're looking at the self-assessments, we're able to dig more into the efficacy of the security and less on it being the compliance related stuff. So, I like the new tools that we have today to be able to automate. And I also like the ability of making it easier for our employees to access all of our resources through single sign-on. I'm even a big fan of passwordless. Like, I fundamentally believe that passwords have, become so weak, even in best efforts, that with passwordless and, using your bio to be able to validate a code and things like that is going to become exceptionally important. And I remember reading a post from one of the credit check CTO CISOs, and I apologize for not remembering their name, who said they saw a reduced risk by 70%.
Wow.
Now, that being said, like, anytime you integrate any kind of technology, you're adding more risk, right? And I believe that, like, for CISOs, they're getting their staffs cut, right? Their staffs are overworked. And if their staffs are getting cut, then you have sort of survivor syndrome. The people that are staying there feel like, wow, I'm here. There's all this extra work. And so the automation helps reduce some of that toil. So, like, as you mentioned earlier, they can focus on the more strategically focused things like, are we looking at the application security from a really true pragmatic perspective, all the way from the backend database all the way to the front end web application, right? Those types of things are super important. So the automation piece, I think, is going to be paramount. And when it comes to AI, the human in the AI portion of it is so important, because you can learn from it and you can ensure that the AI is not making actions that could potentially be risky to your entire ecosystem.
What kind of practical tips do you have for the audience on showing the cost maintenance or the cost reduction? Is there any way in which you can measure cost avoidance or cost reduction?
Wow, that's a tough question.
I'll give you an example. So let's say, just as an example, so let's say we take the example of the security questionnaire.
Yeah.
You could say, look, on average, it took me 3 weeks before, 4 weeks before calendar time to complete the questionnaire, and now it's taking me 3 days or 4 days. So you could put a person hour cost on a person day, and then that's one calculation. The other one is you could take an average control and say it takes 50 minutes to collect the evidence and another 15 minutes to analyze the evidence. And now, by using AI or using API-based automation, we've now brought that down to seconds, right? So you could come up with techniques to show cost optimization or cost avoidance. Because ultimately, when you're going to the CFO, they also want evidence on, if you're asking for more budget, that you're also trying to be careful with your existing spend and optimizing your existing spend.
Yes.
So is there any, and even if you haven't implemented it right now, is there any future vision of how you would want to show the efficiency of the security program?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned some of it earlier. I like the one reference example, excuse me, which is where you're actually showing the reduction in time. Sales pipelines can go very fast.
Yep.
Big for a startup company, pardon me for a second. Having the ability to be able to reduce that time to respond reduces the time to be able to close deals. That's really important. The pipeline and timeline to close deals anyway is very difficult, whether it's to the government or even private sectors,
Yep.
sector organizations. So I like that example. The other things I think about are, again, the investments in tooling And one of the things I'm implementing next quarter, as more of my CIO hat, is looking at our technology spend. Are we utilizing technology that's duplicative or only a small portion of our staffing is using, right? And then focusing on the technology that's going to give us the best bang for the buck.
Bless you.
Pardon me. Thank you. I was coughing a bit. So those are a few things I'm thinking about. And I'm sure there's probably a lot more examples. I don't know. You have any other thoughts based on what I was just mentioning?
I mean, the reason I ask is obviously I'm not a CISO, I'm a CEO, so I'm looking more at how to grow the business, how to protect the business, and how to make the business more efficient, right? Look, those are the three business metrics. The fourth vector is, are the people happy?
Oh, absolutely.
And ultimately, like those are my four lenses
Yeah.
that I'm looking at the health of the business holistically, and the efficiency of the business shows me that we're building a culture where every person, irrespective of their role,
Mm-hmm.
is not looking to waste money and
Yes.
is trying to develop a culture of productivity, but do it in the most efficient manner. So it's creating the right culture, and then obviously from a pure balance sheet standpoint, it is making sure we're not wasting any money. And so, in the spirit of really articulating how GRC can be a profit center, one of the things we've been thinking about is how do we give you tools and dashboards to show that
Yes.
there is a level of efficiency that is either being maintained or improved on over time, uh, to show that you're being very judicious with people's time and effort.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. In our compliance committee, we do show several of the dashboards within our AI platform,
Mm-hmm.
TrustCloud, primarily to show that we're meeting objectives and we're reducing risk over time, which I think is important. The other thing is, I think you bring up a good point, and it's kind of, I mentioned it earlier. If I see that customers are not looking at a particular questionnaire or not downloading a document on a regular basis that I'm providing in the Trust Center to show visibility,
That's right.
why do that effort, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
I also think about in our security operations center, we use our own technology. And the reason we do that is if I have to stand in for the cyber manager or the AppSec engineer, I'm not going to go run queries in this scene. I'm going to go ask questions and within a couple minutes derive if I'm okay so that I can move on to other work. So even
Yep.
those are the things that I'm thinking through for efficiencies. But I do believe that dashboards are important so long as they're aligning to the business and they're supporting the business objectives and you can show that.
Yeah. I love it. Let's get to the last part, Dave. So we talked about
Yes.
how you could measure increasing revenue. We talked about how you could find techniques to reduce cost. The last pillar is reducing risk. And I think we have a couple of comments here around risk reduction, and we can use these two questions to sort of frame the discussion. The first question was about how are you mapping threats, risks, exploits
Yes.
to your GRC program to show how you can create effective defense against these existential threats and risks. So that's sort of question number one. And then the second point that Steve was making is another technique that can be used is to look at your critical customer contracts. And because you know what is the ARR or revenue associated with those contracts,
Mm-hmm.
and map those contracts to controls so that you also know that by meeting those control commitments, you're also protecting breach of contract issues, you're protecting liability against contract
Yes.
commitments, which can also be looked at as risks. You can say, I have a customer contractual risk of my top 20 customers, and I map controls against that risk, and those become my mitigating controls because those controls map to contracts. And so you can continuously measure risk. So from an overall risk standpoint, traditionally people have thought about risks as just quote unquote risk registers, right? It's a workflow where I need to go complete an assessment. How do you think about making risks more business focused and communicating that to your board?
Yeah. So the risk register, in my opinion, so the risk, when I think of it in terms of the risk register, also the third party risk management program,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that third party risk management program looks at things in various stages, whether it's customer data, our data, right, restricted data, whatever it is. And we may evaluate that vendor on a more frequent basis. And there's dashboarding to show the risk in the third-party risk management. We also do it for our connectors, which is the API in our platform. I like the risk register because with the risk register, we have the ability to add additional risks. So maybe there's AI related risks that we're concerned about that we can put in there. That is business related risk. And in the platform, we have the ability to provide those dashboards to say, here's where a risk is to a particular area of our business. And here's a recommendation that we believe we should do to be able to minimize or reduce that risk. One of the things I may say that might be a bit controversial, I'll be interested to see what people have to say. As the CISO, you don't own risk.
Yep.
Your job is to inform on risk and give information to the business so that the business can make informed decisions. But you have to have somewhere to be able to capture what your risk is so you can have that conversation. That's why the risk register is important. That's why your third-party risk management process is important as well.
I love that point that you made, and I think it's a very valid point, which is the CISO is kind of the facilitator of risk management in the business. They can provide the tools, they can provide the understanding, but ultimately the risk should be owned by different stakeholders in the business. They need to understand it, and they need to figure out what they want to do with it. I think that's a really, really great point. Last question on risk before we switch to summarizing the contents of everything we've spoken. I am yet to find many boards that take cyber risk seriously until there's a breach. And maybe people agree with me or disagree with me, I'm not sure. But like in my experience, most boards will listen to information about cyber risk, but they kind of just blow it off in some ways. But suddenly when there is a breach or something, then suddenly it becomes important. How do you build a culture where taking cyber risk seriously is done proactively versus reactively?
That's a great question. I'm going to start out by saying I'm very blessed and to have an extremely supportive board and
That's great
team. So I'm in a very unusual situation. So I do belong to an organization as one of my professional certifications, which is the Qualified Technology Expert.
Mm-hmm.
The focus is to train CISOs on how to speak to the board on risk, right? And do it in a term that the boards can understand, because the boards are concerned about ensuring management, the C-suite is delivering, right? And ensuring that the business is going in the direction for which they're there to advise to ensure it's there, right? That they're meeting those objectives. So I know there are CISO types that don't come from a cyber background, that come from a business perspective. And in those businesses, it's easier for the business to understand them because they speak the same way. But cyber is part of the business. So it's really important to educate the senior leadership team and the board on cyber in terms that they can understand, right? That means not throwing a bunch of vulnerabilities on the screen. Be very specific about, here is the biggest risk to the organization. Here's what we're doing and here's what we need about it. And don't overcomplicate it. Have the conversations and make the recommendations like the Digital Director Network would do. So I'll give them a plug because they're amazing, which is cyber should not be discussed as part of the audit committee. So if anybody's familiar with it, that's where they're looking at, the overall financial state of the organization. They need to be looking at cyber and technology as a separate function on the board to ensure that it's getting the focus it deserves. Because to your point, when cyber has a breach, then all of a sudden it becomes important. The other point I want to bring that I think is probably really important is by acting part of the business, what ends up happening is you need to explain that you are part of the cyber insurance. Your program is part of the cyber insurance. So if you can do that, then the board and the business will be less likely to cut. I hear about entire security functions being cut. And I liken that to, I haven't been in a car accident in 10 years, so I'm going to cancel my auto insurance. Then I get in an accident that costs me millions and millions of dollars to recover, right? So, but if we're not communicating in terms I can understand, or we're going in these lengthy discussions, or we're splashing too many slides. In my research, I've read that the more statistics you put up, the more you lose your audience. Yeah. You just happen to be a mathematician, right? Or a statistician. So, make sure that whatever you're presenting aligns to the business objective and show how what you've done and what you've invested in supports that so that you can start to have those conversations.
Dave, one follow-up question Eric
Yes.
has. One follow-up question Eric has is, I think his question is sort of going along the lines of,
Yeah.
as you're building out your GRC program, and as you are setting up your compliance tools and your GRC tools and setting up your CCF and so on, there is real regulatory risk because you have people like the EU passing, EU AI Acts and EU
Yes.
CRA, and you have changes that are happening to CMMC, and like this, the stuff going on in the industry that impacts the business. So Eric's question is, how do you thread that needle? How do you stay on top of the changes in regulations, which are regulatory in nature, while at the same time you're still building up the core foundation of your program?
Yeah, I love that question. So I started with GDPR and CCPA, which we do internally, and we continuously audit against that. Because if you are doing business in the European Union, whether your organization is physically there or not, you're still subjected to that regulation,
Yeah.
and there's fines associated. There are tools that you can acquire specific to the question, Eric, that will track all the compliance around the world, including in the United States, because there are data privacy and data protection acts coming out in states all the time, right? And we have to adhere to those. So there's tools to be able to monitor those. And quite frankly, the way I would position it, and I'm going to position it, is if we plan on doing business in these localities and regions around the world, we need to understand what those are so that we don't get there and make mistakes, and then we end up having a portion of our revenue being breached as a result of not adhering to those standards. So that should be able to support the need for a tool like that. So that's one of the things that I'm thinking about definitely doing in 2026.
I love it. Um, Dave, I'm going to see if there's any more questions
Please.
in the chat window. Keith Morgan says he loves this session. He says, well done, Dave.
Thank you, Keith.
Keith.
He's a good man.
Dave, you and I have talked a lot about GRC has traditionally stood for governance, risk, and compliance, but it's starting to more and more stand for governance, risk, and check the box.
Yes.
How do we, maybe this is a good way to sort of end today's discussion. As we think about positioning GRC as a profit center, at the end of the day, as practitioners, we also want to bring assurance, right? We're fed up of it becoming kabuki theater with your auditors, or becoming kabuki theater with your vendors, or with your customers.
Yes.
What can CISOs do, for example, like the pledge, the security pledge that you took? What do you think we should be thinking about doing as an industry to bring more assurance, truth, trust, I'll use that word too, to this whole practice?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most important questions that you've asked. And the way I've been thinking about this is, GRC is not going to go away, right? And there's reasons why. But I believe fundamentally, if we're going to do this, we need to do this almost as if it's a trusted ecosystem, right? So if we have NDAs, why can we not tie our trust centers to your GRC tools in an efficient manner where you can ask us questions and it can come from our GRC tool and answer, even if we answer 80% or 90% of your questions automatically, as I like to say,
Yeah.
then that reduces the amount of time to be able to spend to answer the other questions. This traditional, I experienced a lot in my last CISO job. Hey, we need to book 6 hours with you. I don't know anybody, any security team that has 6 hours to talk about vendor risk. I don't, right? I've got all these compliance standards, but I think it comes down to a trust center that represents what you're doing, right? And giving those details where as a customer, you can go into the trust center and download information. But more importantly, if we could actually tie these technologies together so that we could share them in a trusted position, wow, we could really get this done a heck of a lot faster, right? Now, there's some risk associated with it. So you need to make sure that it's like tokened to just that one customer. But I think if we could find ways to work like that, it'll be less checkboxy, it'll be less manual. And quite frankly, the term that I use for the GRC in a lot of ways is it's inadministrable, meaning that you cannot keep up with it. There's just no way. But you have regulatory requirements why you need to do it. You have contractual requirements why you need to do that. You don't ever want to be in technical breach or material breach of contract. So all those things are important. But then also remember that if I go to look at a vendor, I'm looking at it based on what the risk is. So if there's like privacy information risk, I may ask a set of questions around that, but I'm not going to send you 300 questions. If you're SOC 2 type 2, for instance, I'm going to look at that and I'm going to give you a subset. I'd love to see the GRC tools count into that, pull from that vendor, for instance, and be able to parse it down where I could just have like a small amount of information I need to look at. Because if the word trusted is in SOC and there's somewhere, then why don't we trust it, right?
Yeah.
Unless, of course, a lot of the test controls say that not tested that period. So maybe we might have a little bit of a different conversation. But generally, I feel like creating a trusted ecosystem amongst, like the GRC tools that are trying to determine risk and those that we're trying to provide to show that we are taking our trust and confidence position seriously as a good business partner to you would be kind of interesting. And I think it would help.
Dave, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk about this. I think your approach at Andesite to really tie your security program to revenue, to cut costs, but also to reduce risk for the business is really, really refreshing. I want to end this off, Dave, with maybe you can share with the audience a little bit about your book, which we definitely want to send to all the attendees. I know Mark just added a comment that he'd like a copy. So if you could just share a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, and what your objective was to share. What did you want to share with the community with the book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have a couple of friends who are first-time CISOs, and we meet pretty regularly. And when he first started a journey, one of them who had never been a CISO and had never been through a CISO program said, "You should write a book." And I said, "You're crazy. I'm never going to do that, right?" So then my wife said, "Yes, you actually should." The book basically is it is not a snapshot of all these standards and frameworks. The intent was the first 90 days and how you can come in and map to the business. You can go to the website that's listed in the book. You can download those templates and populate them for your organization and your strategy. The second part of the book is about building a strategy, a 1 to 3 year strategy that maps to the business. Every CISO out there has probably heard of the CISO mind map. I love Rafiq Remen's work, and it gets evaluated by everybody in industry, or at least people in the industry. And I remember struggling in my last CISO job to answer the question of my boss, "Why do you need these people?" And so I built an assessment using the CISO mind map, and then categorizing it high risk, not doing, or do it partially doing, et cetera. And so the idea is you use that as your gaps. You create your strategy, what you want to develop, and then how you execute upon that. 79 pages. It's very simple. The intent is not to give you the answer. There's a little bit of humor in there because I'm going to kind of leave the thought on this. And you'll find that the cover art is very kind of whimsical, and it's by design. The reason is we have a very important job. It's very serious, but it doesn't mean we have to be so serious about it. Right? In fact, we'll be more approachable if people see us as being approachable people with a whimsical sense of humor, or even just a sense of humor. So that's the reason. And I remember my wife asking, "Why the big, ribbon on there?" And I said, "Well, there's a lot to untangle in my job." So that's what the book's about. And that's the purpose intent of the little bit of whimsy. I hope that helps.
I love it. And the book is The Lean CISO by Dave Brown. We actually will be giving the book to the attendees. So if any of you want it, please let us know. And that's the famous ribbon that Dave is talking about. And I believe Mrs. Brown is also in this webinar. So big shout out to her. And thank you for attending. And I was hoping you're going to ask us a few hard questions to Dave, but I'm glad you saved him from that. So Dave, again, thank you so much for joining it. I really appreciate the time.
It's been my pleasure. And thank you everybody for who joined. I really appreciate it.
Have a good one.
Yeah, take care.